Hello, everybody. We're just going to be waiting a few seconds to let everybody in before we begin. A warm welcome to all. Okay. Okay, I think we should make a start. So welcome again to all of you to this December session of SIL's webinar series. Today's session will be on language of instruction transitioning in low and middle income countries, and evidence synthesis. The talk today is going to be inspired about one of the projects that SIL has commissioned. But as you know, these webinars are held as a panel discussion on the topic more generally and widely and how it is applicable to different contexts. Just before we start, my name is Marcella Vigneri and I'm Research Fellow with SIL, which is the Center of Excellence for Development, Impact and Learning. We are going to be recording this session. So for those of you who are interested to view it again or share it with others, this will be made available in a week's time, roughly speaking. Also to remind you that SIL is funded through UK aid with money from the British people. Before I go on and introduce my speakers, let me just go over a few housekeeping rules that we have. First of all, please only use the question and answer function to ask your questions, which will be addressed at the end of the interventions. I already told you that the webinar will be recorded, and one further ask is to please complete the post-webinar survey, which you should be redirected to at the end of the webinar, because this provides us with important feedback on how to improve these sessions. So my speakers today are in order: Pooja Nakamura, who is Principal Researcher at the American Institutes for Research and Principal Investigator of SIL's project on which the presentation is inspired; Professor Zelealem Leyew, which is Professor of Linguistics at Addis Ababa University; and last but not the least, Barbara Trudell, who is Director of SIL Africa Learning and Development, who will also be chairing our session. So without any further ado, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you're all here today. Why don't we go ahead and start with the three presentations. Pooja, perhaps you would go first, introduce yourself a little bit, and then go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So my name is Pooja Nakamura. I'm a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research. I will go ahead and share my screen and start, Barb. Is that okay? And then go from there? Yeah, okay. Are you able to see my screen? Great. All right, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Marcella, for the introduction, and Barbara. So as I said, my name is Pooja Nakamura. I'm a principal researcher here at the American Institutes for Research. My own background is in mostly language and literacy research and applications across bilingual and multilingual contexts in low and middle income countries. So today I'm going to be sharing a little bit on this evidence synthesis that's reaching the end, but still in progress on language of instruction transitioning in low and middle income countries. So you know, just to unpack really quickly, the title, Language of Instruction, is pretty self-explanatory, the language in which children are taught in their schooling. And the focus here is on the transitioning of that language of instruction, which means a shifting from one language to another during their early education experience. So just to give you an overview, I'll quickly motivate and give a little bit of background for the study, and then spend a couple of minutes talking about how we can apply mid-level theory to understand the impacts of language of instruction choices, both initial choices and transition choices, on literacy outcomes. And so this is literacy outcomes in that language or in other languages. So it's biliteracy or multiliteracy outcomes. Talk about the methods and process very, very briefly on how we're answering these evidence synthesis questions. And then our two main questions, one is quantitative and one is qualitative. What are the impacts of language of instruction choices on literacy outcomes in all the languages? And what are the key ingredients of a successful language of instruction transition program? So in terms of the motivation, we were in a state of learning poverty in low and middle income countries prior to the pandemic, in which more than half the children in low and middle income countries couldn't read a short text by the time they were 10 years old. And the World Bank is projecting now that that number will reach about 70% in low and middle income countries in the coming years due to the pandemic. At least 37% of children in low and middle income countries are starting their education. They're starting their education in a language they do not use or understand. And even when children do start their education in a language they do use and understand, many need to transition very quickly or soon into another language of instruction. So this raises the question of what an effective language of instruction transition program or policy should look like for children to have optimal learning outcomes. So we've known for years, for decades, that there are multifaceted benefits for initial and prolonged mother tongue language of instruction. This includes higher likelihood of girls and marginalized communities staying in school, more involvement from parents and communities in their children's education, longer term cost benefits for learning, higher learning outcomes, and when it's a well-structured additive bilingual program, cognitive benefits from the first language or the bilingualism or the multilingualism on transferable skills to new languages. However, while we know all this, there are still many well-established, palpable reasons for education systems and stakeholders to want to transition quickly to a new language. These include, for example, the well-documented link between socioeconomic mobility and status and post-colonial language. And this leads to an unwavering demand that keeps increasing for earlier and earlier education in the L2 or the post-colonial language, or what we call the LX, if it's the third or fourth or fifth language a child is learning. There's also this misconception that mother tongue programming is more expensive. And this connects with the fact that there's linguistic heterogeneity in classrooms. So how many mother tongues should we use? How do we choose one when there are many? And even when you know there is one mother tongue and the child will learn best in that mother tongue, there might be a lack of political or community will to implement educational programs, if at all, or even for a long period of time in a particular mother tongue. So the main objective of this evidence synthesis was really to reconcile that tension by synthesizing the evidence. So the tension between longer mother tongue instruction and earlier second language or post-colonial language, and how do we know what the evidence is telling us about the impact of these language of instruction choices, both the initial language of instruction and the transition on student literacy outcomes. So before I dive into our methods and our findings, I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about how we can apply mid-level theory to understand the impacts of language of instruction transition on student literacy outcomes. So for a second, so this is a concept that SETL has done a lot of amazing work around mid-level theory. And this mid-level theory is in the middle of what many projects have as their theory of change, and then these general, abstract, very high-level universal theories. So what kind of a mid-level theory can we do to connect the abstract, general, universal theories to programmatic, contextualized, specific theories of change to make something more generalizable across contexts? So just really quickly, so what are the general theoretical underpinnings that may be important for understanding a language of instruction impact on learning outcomes? So there's a cognitive learning science, which tells us that children will learn to read in languages they understand and can decode or know the letter sound correspondences for. So this is the universal grammar of reading or the cognitive foundations of reading acquisition. We also know that first language skills transfer and support second language reading acquisition, and that language factors and script factors determine the pace of learning. So here are some general theoretical underpinnings for what would look like a successful curriculum or a successful language of instruction program in components. And at the system level, we do know that teacher PD, for example, should be constructed to reflect adult learning principles. Is it self-directed versus goal and relevancy oriented? We also know that teaching can only be successful if the teachers have something to give, called the Peter effect. They can only give if they know what the science of reading looks like. So they need the knowledge of what the science of bilingual reading looks like in order to be able to successfully teach bilingual or multilingual children. So taking some of these general theoretical underpinnings, we propose at a high level, a mid-level theory for this synthesis, or a process theory of change for this evidence synthesis. So holding some of these initial assumptions that there is an availability of school, that teachers want to learn and change, we look at several language of instruction transition activities. And I just want to go through this at a high level to think about how we're applying mid-level theory as opposed to each of the components in a lot of detail. So the language of instruction transition activity could be that it's a mother tongue teaching program, or it could be that it's a program in which the language of instruction is not the child's own language, or the language of instruction is added or changed as they go along. And these are ingredients of the language of instruction program. So they are explicitly part of what the program is. So if these things are in place, we would expect that there's an improved curriculum or improved learning standards or improved teaching and learning materials. So here is where we think the mid-level theory applies. So why do we think that if there's improved quality of standards in curriculum and teaching and learning materials in local languages, that we'll have improved curriculum? So this is where we apply in these contexts what the cognitive foundations of reading acquisition are, and we apply transfer theory. The same goes from now, if we have improved curriculum, why do we think quality of teaching and reading improves, or the motivation to learn improves? That's where we think there are the theories of the Peter effect, the professional development theories, and the components of that will drive the logic under this logic model, which in turn will then lead to the final outcomes. We have a lot of factors around the macro social linguistic environment and a lot of barriers and possible inhibitors, potential moderators to this theory of change, but this is just to kind of show where the theory, mid-level theory, fits in a theory of change for an evidence synthesis. So grounded in that mid-level theory of change, we ask the question of what are the impacts of language of instruction choices, initial language of instruction, and with a major focus on transition on literacy outcomes in both the first language and in the later acquired language. And then we ask qualitatively, looking at some in-depth look at studies that looked at qualitative components of a successful language of instruction transition program. What are the key ingredients for a successful LOI transition program? So in order to answer those two questions, we went through the entire systematic review process, which include the criteria for including studies, search strategy, abstract screening, full text review. We are still in the process of describing and analyzing the studies and disseminating the results, which we're doing now, but we're towards the tail end of this process. So really quickly, the inclusion criteria, we included studies from 1995 to 2020. We included studies in Amharic and English because we wanted to ground the study within at least one country context in which actual language of instruction policy decisions are being made. Professor Zelealem will talk a little bit more about that after this one. We focused on preschool and primary school and low and middle income countries. We looked at any program that had an intervention in it. So this was important. We didn't look at any studies that were non-intervention quantitative or qualitative studies that were looking at correlations or descriptive analysis of relationships, but really only at programs that had an intervention in the intervention explicitly had mother tongue or language of instruction as a component of it. So we looked at mother tongue only studies with a possible later transition. Key point being that mother tongue then builds a foundation for the transition. Language of instruction and home language mismatch, bilingual programs where there's 2 languages simultaneously, and mother tongue with transition happening very quickly as part of the study. We included quantitative studies, qualitative studies, and mixed method studies. And we looked at only studies that actually had literacy outcomes, so just not overall academic achievement or enrollment, but literacy outcomes in either or both of the languages as part of their outcomes of interest. We looked through paid access databases, open access databases, gray literature, websites, physical library searches in Ethiopia, thanks to Professor Zelealem, and key papers in our search strategy. So we very quickly, we started with 22,000 studies in our first search when we had the search criteria. From those, we had 1,994 abstracts that we double reviewed manually by 2 reviewers who went through trainings, and then had 133 full text reviews that were also double reviewed, and then finally had 51 studies for final review that met all our criteria, our relevance, and our and put those through our protocol for quality. For both quantitative and qualitative, we had multiple question protocols to determine quality. So once we went through that, our emerging results for quantitative and the mixed method study showed that out of the 51 full text, 32 were considered relevant. And out of those, we had 11 that were considered good and of the highest quality. So we had 11 randomized control trials that made it into the good criteria, 11 that were fair, and 7 that were unclear. And as you can see, they were across the world, and most of our studies came out of South Africa, Ethiopia, and Kenya for the quantitative. So for the qualitative studies, out of the 16 that were included, 8 were considered high quality for the qualitative protocol. And here as well, we had 2 studies that came out of South Africa, Cameroon, and Rwanda, and the rest were just 1 study each. So from these high quality studies, what did we find was the impact of language of instruction choices on literacy outcomes in both L1 and L2? So we answered this question through a meta-analysis, and we found that for the quantitative results, that the mother tongue language of instruction leads to sizable significant impacts on a variety of mother tongue literacy subskills, including symbol recognition, sentence level reading or decoding, mother tongue reading comprehension, national language reading comprehension. So national language being the Kiswahili or Hindi, the language of the national language of the country, and international language reading comprehension, or the post-colonial language, French or English. But critically, after scouring the world for these studies, we find very, very small number of high quality studies, and publication bias was evident. So it skews the results towards those studies that were published, and maybe those that weren't really did not see any significant impact on anything, and therefore chose not to publish them. So we had a significant publication bias as well. In terms of the qualitative analysis that we did on the key ingredients of what a successful LOI transition program looks like, we found that 1 was the availability of high quality materials in the language that's being taught, in the mother tongue, mother tongue language specific curriculum design, and teacher professional development that is especially focused on language supportive pedagogy and structured bilingual, multilingual pedagogy. So these are kind of similar points, but they kind of reflect back on the theoretical links, the mid-level theoretical links between our activities and our outcomes. So it was really the quality of the teaching and the pedagogy supportive of the bilingual, multilingual learning that seemed to be critical for the language of instruction program to be effective. So the preliminary implications from what we're finding is that as studies have shown for a long time, including meta-analyses, initial mother tongue language of instruction leads to significantly higher literacy subskills, both in the mother tongue and some very limited but strong evidence for later languages as well. And that the design of a mother tongue based language of instruction program requires attention to teaching and learning materials and curricula that are reflective of the science of bilingual learning. So the critical piece here is there still remains significant gaps in our knowledge in terms of effective language of instruction transition. The study really wanted to focus on language of instruction transition, but even the limited studies that were there really focuses still on the impact of initial mother tongue language of instruction for literacy outcomes in that language. And we still have significant gaps in understanding the timing and the grade level in which effective transition can be made, and what skills, and critically under what macro sociolinguistic and more local conditions can LOI transition be more effective. So thank you, and I will stop there and pass it back.
Great. Thank you so much, Pooja. That was a lot of good stuff. So thank you for that. Professor Zelealem, why don't we go to you next? Introduce yourself briefly and then give your presentation.
Mm-hmm. Can you hear me? Where are my slides? Where is Susie? Oh yeah. Thank you, Susie. Thank you, Pooja. Thank you, Marcella. Thank you, Barbara and Susie, for making me part of this webinar. Well, I'm sorry, Marcella, for including many acronyms and abbreviations. In my talk, I will definitely, mention them in detail. And well, my presentation, the whole idea of my presentation is to tell you the facts on the ground regarding the language of instruction and mother tongue education in Ethiopia in pre-primary and primary schools. And I will touch upon policy issues and the opportunities we have had, and the challenges as well, and the way forward. And I would say this is simply a supplementary introduction to what Pooja has mentioned. She has done a lot of work, and I have learned a lot from this team, particularly from Pooja during our when she was here conducting her research, and I have learned a lot. My area of research is linguistic description, as I mentioned it yesterday, the day before, the description of Ethiopian languages, particularly least known languages. But who else will be interested in language education or the question of a language of instruction in Ethiopia today than a responsible linguist like myself? The first slide is about the background of Ethiopia, sociolinguistic profile of Ethiopia. I mean, multilingual, obviously, as you all know, there are about 11 languages spoken in the only African countries, as far as I know, where you have these competing languages. And the landmark here is 1 million speakers. And Africa-wide major languages, we have Afan Oromo and Amharic and other very competent languages. And we have currently introduced 4 more federal working languages in addition to Amharic, Afan Oromo, Afar, Somali, and Tigrinya. And there are about 50 languages that have been brought to school as medium of instruction and the school subject. We have different numbers in different articles and books. And this is the latest I read. 50 languages, and we have monolingual, bilingual, and multilingual education going on in the classroom, in the teacher training colleges, etc. And Ethiopia is special again, not in terms of these competing languages, but in terms of, scripts. We have two scripts competing, Latin and Ethiopic. Next slide, please. Oh, the next slide. Can I go to the next? Okay. Well, the objectives of this presentation is, as I mentioned earlier, to just share experiences, Ethiopian experiences on language choice, script choice, you know, the choice of suitable orthography for different Ethiopian languages, and the optimal time of using mother tongue instruction. I'm sorry for these acronyms, and the transfer of skills, you know, to transitions from mother tongue to OT is other tongue. Optimal time of using transitioning to other tongue. Well, Pooja rightly mentioned about this, and what opportunities and challenges have we had so far since the introduction of mother tongue education in Ethiopia in 1994 and thereafter. The next slide. And policy issues, all Ethiopian languages, as far as policy is concerned, I mean, as the policies are perfect. I mean, the constitution, regional constitutions, or federal constitutions, policies in written forms are excellent. All Ethiopian languages have equal state recognition. Federal regions have the right to choose their official languages and develop them to the level they want. And the 1994 education and training policy that has brought with it the mother tongue education and language of instruction is a novel idea. All these are novel ideas, and mother tongue education was introduced obviously for a better learning outcome and for psychological satisfaction and for positive attitude towards their, you know, ancestral languages. Any language can be brought to school as a school subject and medium of instruction as far as the 1994 education and training policy is concerned. And mother tongue should be used as a language of instruction in principle, as it is stipulated in the Ministry of Education different documents and in the 1994 education and training policy from grade 1 to 8. The point here is, do we apply it? Right, and Amharic should be as a national lingua franca, as you know, a federal working language. It should be introduced to all Ethiopian schools, but from grade 3, as it is written in the policy documents. But do we apply it uniformly? English as an international language or a foreign language, a very useful language, obviously. Should be introduced as a school subject as of grade 1, right? And trilingual policy is going on in Ethiopia, primary school, mother tongue education, and other tongues like Amharic, language 2, language 3. I mean, where do we, you know, exit from mother tongue to other tongue to Amharic and English is a question, right? And the policy, again, policy issues, kindergarten and primary school teachers are expected to be trained in the nationality languages, but what's going on the ground is not being implemented uniformly. Some use the nationality languages, some do not use the nationality languages, but instead use Amharic or English. The above official language of instruction policy has not been implemented as is stipulated, as I mentioned it earlier. There are all kinds of irregularities because it is up to the regional governments or the provincial governments and lower level, you know, government offices that can decide on these issues. And irregularities in the exit from mother tongue instruction to English or Amharic, there are no uniform, like as we will see in different regions, there are different kinds of implementations. Transition to English, for instance, in some regions, it starts at grade 5, in some regions at grade 7, in some other regions at grade 9. For some or all subject areas. Amharic as a subject has not been, has not been implemented uniformly because it appears in different grade levels. Next slide, please. Yeah, these are the samples I took from, I think from Hugh's work, no, from the USID 2021. I got some problems in this. I mean, this is the Amhara, what's going on in the Amhara region. You have 4 languages being used as a language of instruction from grade 1 to 4, from grade 5 to 6, and from grade 7 to 8, we have different, we have Amharic, Aungi, Hamdanga, and Afan Oromo, the languages spoken in this region, right? And we have here Oromia, the Oromia region, where you have Afan Oromo and Amharic, Afan Oromo and Amharic, Afan Oromo and Amharic, all content subjects. I should inform you that Afan Oromo and Amharic are not being used in the same school, but there are schools, Afan Oromo medium schools and Amharic medium schools, especially in towns and cities in the Oromia regional state. And we go to Afar, well, Amharic from grade 1 to 4, and language of instruction in grades 5 to 6 Amharic. I doubt this very much. It is a 2021 publication, but I know that Afar is being used as medium of instruction and school subjects from grade 1 to 4. That is what I know, right? And please, the next slide. And another sample from Benshangul Gumuz regional state, where you have 5 major languages. Among these 5 major languages, excluding Amharic and other languages, even though Shinasha, Gumuz, and Berta, the red marked languages, are not mentioned in this source, in this article, I know that Shinasha, Gumuz, and Berta are being used as language of instruction in this region. I mean, we have to take care. I mean, when we produce articles and publications, we have to get the most recent information about what is going on in different regions in Ethiopia, right? Yeah, and we have many opportunities as a result following the introduction of mother tongue education since 1994. Mother tongue instruction is all over the world. It is very advisable for its pedagogical advantages and better learning outcomes, obviously, as mentioned clearly and neatly mentioned by Pooja earlier, and for its psychological satisfaction on the side of parents and students and teachers, well, members of the ethnic group, I would say. And it is a good way of language development through mother tongue education. You reduce these languages into writing. We call it graphization or codification, and we modernize to some extent these languages by adding more lexical elements that can express and science and technological concepts. And we are committed to write more on this in these languages, and the tradition of literature develops from time to time. And knowing more languages has become a fashion these days, because I mean, monolingualism is not advisable. Even our youngsters today want to know more Ethiopian languages, in addition to their ambition to be very good in English and other international languages. And a very good thing is the transfer of skills, right, of students from their mother tongue to other tongue, to the second language or to the third language, right? Next slide, please. But we have all kinds of opportunities surrounding mother tongue education or language of instruction, and commitment of parents, teachers, and students, and the Ministry of Education and the government at large, but it is not without challenge, right? There are all kinds of challenges that we have been facing in the implementation of mother tongue education in the primary and pre-primary schools in Ethiopia. Right, first one, readiness. Well, sometimes, to bring a language as medium of instruction and the school subject, that language should be made ready, like the script choice, the suitable orthographies, the syllabus, textbooks, dictionaries, primers, and other reading materials, should probably take, experts or stakeholders should work on these issues and think about these issues before decisions. And all the decisions, I would say, not today, but a couple of years ago, immediately after the introduction of mother tongue education in Ethiopia, the decisions were exclusively made by politicians, and the political intervention was high. And there were complaints from parents, teachers, and other stakeholders on because their voices were not heard. And the teacher training colleges were really poorly organized, right? And there are tremendous developments today, but we cannot still say that the teacher training is 100% sufficient. Rushed policy implementations, lack of uniformity in policy implementation, lack of rigorous follow-up activities to just solve problems of language of instruction or mother tongue education in general. Please, next slide. And we see some kind of negative attitude towards languages that we see it in our university today, because when students come to our university or to other universities for that matter, they come only with their mother tongues, right? They don't speak Amharic, some of them, not all, and some of them do not speak English either. And when they come to freshman classes, instructors face problems, and the university is facing a huge problem regarding these monolingual students coming to university campuses. And the impact of mother tongue on other tongue, well, impact. I'm not saying that it is a serious problem. It's not a serious problem. It has its contributions in the transition from mother tongue to other tongue, but we have to study the impacts of mother tongue when we transit to other tongue. And the problem of identifying a language from a dialect is a serious problem, because there have been some attempts of doing harmonization of different dialects or choosing a standard variety from, by applying two methods, at least one variety or a composite kind of variety. There are all kinds of problems. And those of you who have heard, probably Barbara, who knows about Woga Goda, Walaita Gamo Gofa Dauro, that claimed, probably, lives and property devastations, and scarcity of human and financial resources are challenges to some extent, and minority linguistic rights. There are still many languages that want to be written and be brought to school as medium of instructions and school subjects. And please. And less emphasis on an optimal threshold to transitioning to language 2 and language 3. We don't conduct research on this issue, and it is probably Pooja's research that will probably contribute a great deal in Ethiopia and the rest of African countries. Where is optimal time to transit from mother tongue to the other language? When should exit from mother tongue more feasible? Is too early transition to other tongue or language to, in the Ethiopian case, Amharic or English, advisable? Is too late transition to other tongue advisable? Which could be the optimal transition to Amharic or English? I mean, this research output will definitely lead us or benefit us to just give more attention to the best time of transition from mother tongue to. And how do we determine optimality? That is another question. Please. Okay, and when forward, probably a couple of things. I mean, we have to consider, I mean, when we think of mother tongue education or language of instruction or the transition from mother tongue to other tongues, language 1, language 2, or language 3, in which students sometimes are burdened with languages and subjects. I mean, the language use, which I usually take it as a model, even though it is too old, 1965 Fishman's, the WHs, who speaks? We have to think of the teacher training and which language, the mother tongue or other tongue, and what is the status of the language. Corpus planning and status planning should come here, and to whom the students should draw our attention, should take our attention, and by whom, you know, again, the teacher is very important, right? And what the subject is very important: social sciences, natural sciences, etc., as we saw it earlier, the bilingual education and multilingual education in terms of subjects. And when the grade level is very important, right? And where, right? The setting, in the urban setting, rural setting, the classroom, out of the classroom, etc., and how refers to the method, right? And the last slide, probably well-prepared language for instruction and spelling error and school subject. I mean, well-prepared language, as I mentioned it earlier, right? In terms of reading materials, in terms of dictionary, in terms of phonological awareness and morphological and syntactic and semantic awareness. Well-organized and sound teacher training institutions or colleges, less political intervention and more stakeholders participation. Politicians have always interest in education, but it shouldn't hamper, it shouldn't, it should rather assist, you know, the education, because education is a key to development of countries like it. Up of more of students, I mean, language learning or position to a second language, third should be. Okay. The most optimal ratio to transit from mother tongue to other tongue, well, this is going to be the result of this quite interesting and comprehensive research led by Pooja, and the continuous assessment of teacher and teaching and learning activities, and identify the problems and give immediate solutions to all these kinds of problems. When you go out for a field work in different urban and rural areas in Ethiopia, teachers have many complaints and the surround, surrounded by language issues, and they're very, very critical. Involve curriculum experts and other stakeholders in mother tongue and other tongue educational activities. Consider research outputs published locally. We have many PhD theses, many MA theses, and other interesting articles and books. But most of the time, I read yesterday the publications by different authors on Ethiopian ongoing mother tongue education or education in general. And there are very, very small number of works mentioned by Ethiopian, domestic, scholars in different universities in Ethiopia. I think we have to be vigilant. We have to consider all these publications, some of them really wonderful publications, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Zelealem. That was really, really amazing. And what's going on in Ethiopia and has been for decades is very fascinating. Susie, if you can go ahead and share my slide set. Yeah, so what I'd like to talk to you about today, I'm calling Planning for the Inevitable: Program Strategies for Effective Language Transition in African Schools. Next slide. So for the vast majority of African learners, participation in the formal education system inevitably means trying to learn in a foreign language. And usually that's a language that they have not mastered. Next slide. Now, sooner or later in their school career, it is going to happen. And most certainly it's going to happen in secondary school. Being taught in a language they speak in primary school, we know can produce much stronger learning outcomes. But success in primary school is really only the first step for aspiring African learners, as it should be. And the next step is to master academic skills in the language that's used in the secondary school, which is nearly always, for African learners, a second language. Next slide. So my team and I had some questions, and one question we had in looking at this is, what are the language strategies that have been effective in helping learners succeed in the second language medium secondary school? So we're not talking about, comparing transition within primary school. We're saying, okay, it's going to happen in secondary school. So how do you prepare kids best for that? So we did a literature review in 2019. It was not nearly as rigorous or as quantitative as what Pooja described to you. But my team and I did this literature review, and we examined studies in sub-Saharan Africa on programs that involved first language medium instruction in primary school. So we looked at all those, and among those, we looked for evidence of the impact of those first language mediums programs on students' ability to succeed in secondary school. Next slide. And what we looked for in the programs and in the write-ups on the programs were two things. We looked for evidence of strong learning outcomes that happened at the end of the primary school program, leaving exams and so on. And then we also looked at features, or we looked for features that have been linked to, in the literature, to successful transition to second language medium secondary school. So things that the literature shows, these are good things for secondary school. Next slide. And those features included the number of years of first language medium instruction in primary school, the use of the first language across the curriculum, rather than for teaching just one subject, which usually that one subject is reading. Teacher training that is specific to the first language medium program, not just general teacher training. The provision of textbooks in the first language for all subjects. That first language reading is being taught as a subject for at least the first 4 years. So not only is the first language the medium of instruction, but reading is taught as a subject in the first language for the first 4 years. Systematic instruction in oral second language skills. And then content areas that are taught in the first language also being assessed in the first language. Probably that is a big challenge in a lot of our programs here. So these were the sorts of features that are in the literature that you really need to have. So we looked for those in the program reviews. So we found documentation of about 50 first language medium primary school programs in Africa. And out of the 50, we identified 9 programs that had what we would have called adequate relevant data on the question. So looking at the 9, 4 of those 9 programs, we were able to assess them as effective. And by effective, what we meant was they led to successful entry into secondary school. That was our definition. So based on the data, these were assessed as effective. Next slide. And the 4 effective programs by that criterion included Ethiopia's 6-year and 8-year first language medium primary school programs, Mali's Pédagogie Convergente program, Nigeria's Ile-Ife 6-year program in Yoruba language, and Burkina Faso's École Bilingue programs. Go ahead. And the one feature that was common to all 4 of the effective programs and was not found in any of the 5 ineffective programs was that the effective programs all had 5 years or more of first language medium instruction across the curriculum. So not just for literacy learning. Now, there were other features that were common to the effective programs. For example, having teaching and learning materials in the first language for all subjects. And then that they paid attention to second language learning, which we don't often think of in this context, I think. So that included pedagogical materials for second language acquisition, specifically written for that purpose for those kids. And then teacher training in explicit methods for teaching second language acquisition. Next slide. So what does that mean? I think there are 5 takeaways that we took away anyway. The first takeaway is that there is a popular myth, maybe you've heard it, that the best way for African kids to succeed in school is by maximum exposure to the second language, preferably right from preschool. It's not true. Next takeaway. Reading needs to be taught as a subject. Kids need to be taught to read, and it needs to be taught in the language that the child understands. In many African curricula, you do not find reading as a subject. It really needs to be there in the curriculum. Next slide. And a curriculum that uses the first language only for that reading subject, but teaches all the other subjects in the second language is actually not adequate for the child's school success. And you see this in a number of programs in Africa right now, early grade reading programs. Next slide. Another takeaway that using the first language orally in the classroom does help kids learn better. But having teaching and learning materials in the first language is really essential to effective learning. And the final takeaway is that teaching the second language as a subject, first teaching oral skills and then written skills throughout the primary school years, is key to later success in formal schooling. And if you actually wanted to see the paper on this, the study we did, there's the data for it. So that's just a little bit I wanted to share with you about a small study that we have done in my team. I didn't actually introduce myself. I'm the director of an Africa-based education and learning consulting group called SIL Africa Learning and Development. And some of my team and I were the ones who did this. So, okay, so let's go make my screen go over there. And let's look at basically what's happening in these studies. I've got some questions. I think it might be interesting, Zelealem and Pooja. I see, so Zelealem, you have to leave before too long, so let's do a little talking here first. We heard things from you or from me about the science of reading. We heard about high quality teaching and learning materials. We heard about, or reference to the optimal time for transition. We heard about whether multilingualism makes things easier or makes things harder in transition. I would love to hear some of your thoughts about just any one of those as you were thinking about it in your presentation. The issue of high quality materials, what does that mean? The issue of the science of reading, that teachers need to understand the science of reading, what that refers to. What's the best time for transition? And I think Zelealem, you spoke about that as well. And then the question of whether if you have a lot of languages in the classroom, does that make transition easier or harder? Now, please don't answer all those. Please, I would like you to choose one. Just choose one and talk to us about that one. In fact, Zelealem, maybe you could go first because you're the one who's going to have to leave us sooner.
Yeah, well, certainly Pooja will give the best answer for all these questions. Well, multilingual education, it all depends on the definition you give to bilingual and multilingual education. Can it be defined or viewed by dividing like social sciences for this subject and natural sciences for the other subject, like Amharic and English, or Afan Oromo and English, or Afar and Amharic? And this is kind of bilingual education, or the interaction between students and teachers in the classroom. In most of the classrooms in Ethiopia, I would say there is a kind of bilingual shifting from one language to the other language. I was in Hadia area about a couple of years ago, and I was in the classroom where a Hadia teacher who is expected to teach his students in Hadia is frequently shifting to Amharic and Hosanna. I was in Hosanna in the town. I don't know what's going on in the urban areas. But you know, teachers just, they relax switching from one language to another language, and sometimes to English, right? And you have a kind of multilingual interaction between students and teachers. And that will probably be for the benefit of students, or perhaps to, you know, to cover the weakness of teachers in their own language, or in Amharic, or in English for that matter. We have to study it. And high quality material, I don't really know. Pooja will probably answer this question. I am interested in only like producing primers and dictionaries and pedagogical grammars and some reading materials at least, so that we can promote, you know, the language of instruction and mother tongue education promisingly. And the best time of transition, I cannot say anything on this because I haven't done rigorous research on that, because I mean, the point here is in Ethiopia, we have different transitions, right? And can we choose one as an optimal transition, or go ahead with different types of transitions? And I hope the end result of this research will take us to the best time of transiting from mother tongue to the second language. I'm not sure if I answer
no, your thoughts on these things. Sure. Pooja, how about you?
Yeah, really quick. Thanks for those questions, Barbara, and thank you, Professor Zelealem, for those responses. I don't think we have the answers, but I just, you know, in terms of transition timing, I think that was the impetus behind this evidence synthesis, and that was really what we were trying to find in terms of, is there rigorous responses to that question of when is the optimal time to transition, and found there wasn't, right? So at least what we've done right now is we found both things, that the more the better, but we also found that there's increasing demand for sooner. So the tension, the empirical answer to that remains unknown. And you know, I think we need to, at least that we can establish that there isn't enough evidence from a systematic review perspective in terms of when the optimal timing of transition is. So I think it's important for us to think as a community as to how can we start answering that question, because that is the question. Then do we have to think of it as a skill-based transfer or transition timing as opposed to grade-based transition? What skills does a child need to have? What skills does a teacher need to have in order to have optimal transition timing in place? So that's, you know, in terms of transition timing and the kind of research approaches and analytical methods we might consider to answer those questions may may come out of this evidence synthesis as a key gap. And really quickly on the science of reading for quality, I think that came out in what you shared, Barbara, and what Professor Zelealem shared. And I think we still rely heavily on the science of reading from monolingual alphabetic contexts, and try to understand what's the science of reading. So what are the cognitive learning processes that underpin acquisition of a gaze script and then an alphabetic script and a different language spoken at home? So what is the quality look like for a bilingual, multilingual mind with different kinds of constraints in the classroom and scripts that are being used, et cetera. So even the science of reading itself needs to be fine-tuned for these kind of contexts where we're working in, and not just borrow from the monolingual alphabetic models of science of reading.
Interesting, good points, good points. I think it is the question, what's the optimal transition time? Because you are dealing on one hand with more is better, as what I saw in the studies that we looked at, and yet you have significant pressure from stakeholders, parents, students themselves, teachers perhaps, and they will vote with their feet if they think it's too long, in which case you lose them altogether. And so I think it's interesting, the inevitable balance between the sociocultural, the language attitudes about education, and the science or what we know about reading pedagogy and so on. And you can't ignore the socio-political context and what's going on there. It just doesn't work because these are real world projects. And I think actually, Professor Zelealem, someone has asked a question too, and I wanted to pose it to you. And it has to do with the more social space related to bilingual and multilingual education. And one of the questions here was, what is the impact on social integration in the schools across ethnic groups? So if you have a multilingual space or community, and what is the impact on social integration within the schools, social cohesion, to carry out these, especially longer, or maybe not even the longer, maybe the 4-year as well, bilingual education projects. You have to choose a language or languages, and inevitably something doesn't get chosen. Someone's language is not chosen. So how does this, the whole mother tongue education program that is going in Ethiopia, affect social integration and social cohesion in the schools?
Well, I think that requires some kind of study in order to reach to a plausible answer for this question. But as a person who visits, the urban and rural areas of Ethiopia for research consumption, I would say, I mean, like, before 1994, Amharic was only the sole medium of instruction in all Ethiopian schools, be it elementary, well, in elementary and junior high schools. And by then, I mean, there were no problems of inter-ethnic interaction. I mean, it was not, I mean, everybody, not everybody, there are still monolingual speakers of the respective, ethnic languages. But as far as education is concerned, as far as the educated, right, elementary school graduates, high school graduates are concerned, I mean, everybody spoke or used to speak Amharic. But since the introduction of mother tongue education, I mean, the knowledge of Amharic, especially by those students from the countryside, excluding towns, big towns and cities, is deteriorating from time to time. And that's why I mentioned our students, especially coming, most of them are from Oromia region, right? And Afan Oromo is one of the most competent languages in Ethiopia, obviously. And these students, of course, they are young students. And after the freshman, the first semester of the first year, they start using Amharic, to communicate with their fellow students in their dormitories and classrooms. But for the first semester, first year, they have had problems, all kinds of problems. They cannot interact with their instructors because the English is not there. As you know, Barbara and Pooja and most of you, English doesn't have a strong roots in Ethiopia because of these colonial and all these historical reasons. And somebody, I forgot his name, mentioned that English is not a medium of education or instruction, but a medium of confusion in Ethiopia. Well, this was a couple of, maybe many years ago. The interest of students, our students and the young generation to be proficient in English is high, obviously, and they have a positive attitude. But I don't know when our English proficiency will scale up, will come to the maximum, and we have to work on that. But the social interaction in towns and cities is Afan Oromo is very good, the second lingua franca, I would say, and people use it. And Amharic is still the national lingua franca across the different regions. But the knowledge of Amharic, or the number of second language learners, second language speakers of Amharic, some people say it is decreasing, and I would say it is increasing due to many other regions, because in some other regions like the southern nations, nationalities, and regional state, Amharic is still the regional official language. And Afar, until very recently, in Afar, Amharic was in Gambella, in Benshangul Gumuz, Amharic is a regional official language, and it is increasing. But with the students, there is this attitude and other things which I don't want to talk it now. You know, there are all kinds of situations, but you know, the social bondage is still strong, I would say.
Well, that's helpful. I think in my experience, the introduction of multilingual education doesn't necessarily generate social or diminish social cohesion. It actually perhaps highlights the social cohesion issues that are already there. I'm thinking of Ghana and the recent MLE program, their early grade reading program in 11 Ghanaian languages, which is amazing. And the materials were beautiful and the implementation nationwide, but there's 40 plus languages in Ghana. And the cases where parents said, why am I sending my child, you know, to learn, you know, some Konkomba, whatever the language was, it's not English. And it's not our language. So why would we learn the language of someone in another community where, you know, it's a Ghanaian language that isn't as important as English anyway? And so there was they basically said either add our language to the program or give us English. And I don't think that the program generated those challenges or those attitudes, but it certainly brought them to the fore. Pooja, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, really quick. I've seen what you said also, Barbara, and about the a multilingual education program actually highlighting whatever social cohesion or uncohesion there is to start with. So one thing is terminological that we saw in India is that there's actually artificial boundaries that are drawn when you do different mother tongues in linguistically heterogeneous communities, as opposed to a language of wider communication or like an Amharic or an Afan Oromo, like Professor Zelealem was talking about. So at what point is it the language of wider communication versus a mother tongue? What degree of heterogeneity do you actually need to use to cover all mother tongues before you decide that there's one language that could be more applicable across a community? Is a big challenge, and one that I think is actually more terminological. When mother tongue itself is such a loaded word and is used in policy quite widely, and you know, just trying to figure that out is one piece of that puzzle.
That's true, and I think at least my understanding certainly in Anglophone East and Southern Africa, the term mother tongue is quite commonly used. I think in many other parts of the world it's not. And first language, home language, a number of other terms are used, but mother tongue just seems to fit here, and it's how people see it. And there are a lot of communities here that are monolingual still, many. And I think that possibly reflects that. So I think it depends from country to country as well. And here in South Africa, I'm living in Cape Town. You have almost a linguistic identity that is multilingual. And so people say, that's who I am. I'm multilingual in all these languages. Whereas perhaps possibly in Togo, in Uganda, in some other places, you would say, no, this is who I am. And it's one language. And the others are foreign languages. They're second languages, but they're not the one that is me. And I think it's interesting when you try to reconcile those two, you know, the idea of linguistic human rights, you know, my language, my identity, my rights. And then you have the linguistic citizenship model, which says, wait a minute, we use languages for whatever we want. And I think probably you get very different uptake of multilingual education or bilingual education programming in those contexts. And they have to have something else in them in order to be relevant. So I think that's an important piece too. Well, it is almost time to close. This was amazing. Thank you so much for all the good comments and so on. There were many questions that were asked, including from our brother in Sudan. I'm sorry we didn't have time to answer all the questions. I don't know, Marcella, we could turn it back over to you. Is there anything you would like to say in closing? You're muted.
Marcella, you're muted.
Apologies. So thanks, thanks Barbara, and thanks to Zelealem and Pooja. This was indeed a very engaging presentation. Just a couple of reminders to our audience. The first one is to please complete the post-webinar survey, which will be redirected to
Oh,
Marcella's just breaking up, so I think I'll just say, if you can complete your post-webinar survey, you will be redirected to after the webinar. We would be very grateful as it helps future webinars. And thank you to all of our speakers who came, and also to our audience members. And we will get the recording up in a week or so if you want to share it with anybody. And that's on the SEDL website, which is sedlprogram.org.
wonderful.
Thank you all, and have a good evening, good afternoon.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.